The end is where we start from, ending as beginning in the vision of C.S. Lewis. So would you please welcome Reverend Dr. Malcom Guite.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks to Stuart and Curtis and so many others for putting this on. It's great to be here, and I've learned a great deal already. I think the papers, I wish I could have had, in another forbidden Harry Potter reference, I wish I could have had Hermione's time turner and managed to be in both parallel sessions at the same time. I was sorry to miss one set, but the other set that I heard in here were really excellent. So I'm looking forward to being, both educated and spiritually nourished by the papers that are still to come. So the end is where we start from, which you'll see is but at beginning as ending in the vision of C.S. Lewis. I have to say, I hope you'll feel that it's not mere mischief that I've opened a title for a paper on C.S. Lewis with a quotation from T.S. Eliot. Obviously, we know that they were sparring partners in life, although later on in their lives, they were actually, I think there was a real friendship and a reconciliation. And for a detailed understanding of the Eliot-Lewis relationship, I refer you to your own Curtis White. I had the pleasure of being the external examiner on Curtis's doctorate, which concerned Lewis and Eliot, and it was brilliant. But if they were sparring partners and had literary differences, even during their own lifetimes, Lewis said, as he put it in the preface to Paradise Lost, a book in which he was going to completely dismantle Eliot's take on Milton, he nevertheless said, but Mr. Eliot and I agree far more profoundly on a subject of far greater importance, delicately alluding to the fact that they were both converts to Christianity. So, but I feel free to quote Eliot at the beginning of a Lewis lecture and say the end is where we start from, not least because that end, which is also a beginning, is a place from which I believe they have also started sparring partners in life. They will be rejoicing together now at the supper of the Lamb. And since the Lamb is also the Lion, I think we might even imagine them feasting together at Aslan's table. So I speak of ending as beginning, but we'll come to that perhaps a little later. But since the resurrection, indeed not just the resurrection, but the incarnation, death and resurrection, the Christ event, as some call it, since that is burst, as it were, from eternity into time, erupted in the middle of history as myth was made history, became fact, something that Tolkien demonstrated so powerfully to his friend Lewis. We have to speak not only of the end as beginning, as we will do when we come to the last words of the last battle, surely one of the most glorious endings of any book ever, just as you have the sorrow of closing the cover on the last of these beloved books, you have the promise of a story that will be told forever. But I think we have also to do with what some theologians have called, they've indeed named the resurrection, the end in the middle. Because the new creation of which we are to speak here begins erupting in the midst of the old creation, in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And since we are going to reflect theologically as well as literary, in a literary way here, we have to say that, I think the watchword for all theology, whichever denomination it comes from, is Paul's words, I resolved to know nothing amongst you save Christ and him crucified, the power of God and the wisdom of God. We're just a tiny little thing on the edge of a vast cosmos. We could speculate endlessly about God and be entirely in error. Our only basis for any theology, properly speaking, is the outlandish and daring supposition that God might have revealed himself. And then we can have faith in that revelation. Then we can do some thinking. That's what Anselm says. Theology is fides quaerens intellectum. It's faith-seeking understanding. So I take it as the beginning, the very touchstone of all theology, that insofar as we can know anything about God, and therefore anything about our eternal life with God in the new creation, we have to look to Jesus. And therefore his bodily resurrection and all the anticipatory joy it brings, but also the puzzles it sets, the extraordinary apparent contradictions, which Lewis writes about, between, a body that appears in the middle of a locked room and yet also is happy to eat broiled fish. A person who walks on water, but also says, in one of my favorite of all of Jesus' sayings, boldly says, come and have breakfast. Possibly, insofar as that was the first breakfast in John's gospel, I assume that the first morning in heaven, we're all going to enjoy second breakfast. So I'm looking forward to it for one. But yet, this is also the one who is present to us in bread and wine. The one who says, whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do it to me. Now, what kind of a body is that? That's simultaneously active at two ends of the world? Well, we have a little hint of it, even in the old creation, when we see quantum entanglement and we see things connected faster than light can ever connect them. We have a few hints in the old creation. But what we see in the resurrection of the body of Jesus is the inbreaking of the new creations. Once we see that, once we understand a little bit about them, we may be able to talk sensibly about the last things and even to entertain some hopes about our own resurrection. So Lewis deals with these great themes throughout his writing, but for the purpose of this address, I'm going to take you to three places where he deals, I think at some depth, with the related pairs of death and resurrection, both Christ's and ours, and old and new creation, because they're all finally found in Christ. So I want to take you to three places, and I'm afraid I haven't got wonderful slides, but partly because when I went to lectures, when people first started using slides as opposed to handouts, I found that whereas I could make notes on the handout and take it home for reading, that if I actually went up to the slide and started making notes, the organizers objected to it, and I couldn't take the screen home. So that's why I've given you a paper handout. And we're going to, as you see from this, we're going to let Lewis do a lot of the speaking. So I'm going to take you to three places where he deals with death, resurrection, old and new creation. The first is the grand miracle, which was a sermon preached at St. Jude on the Hill in London in 1945, a time indeed of ends and beginnings. I mean, Churchill had some years earlier said, we haven't yet come to the end, but perhaps we've come to the beginning of the end. So ends and beginnings were maybe in the air in 1945. And in fact, two of the three passages in Lewis I want to examine with you, two of them are 1945. So there's the grand miracle, which I think is one of his finest pieces of theology, and it's been hugely formative for me. So that's preached at St. Jude on the Hill in 1945. Then, unsurprisingly, I'm going to take you to the Great Divorce, also published in 1945. And then finally to the Last Battle, which appeared in 1954, so some 9 years later. And we're going to begin, therefore, with the grand miracle, with his whole reflection on the whole Christ event, on the incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus as a single thing, as what he calls the grand miracle. Now, it's a brilliant sermon. I'll try and summarize it a little bit. He starts by critiquing the so-called the policy of a certain school of mainly German biblical criticism, summarized really in the works of Rudolf Bultmann, which was a program called demythologizing, a program that had terrible and tragic consequences for the whole of biblical studies, which is why lots of us are involved now in remythologizing. But he said the point about demythologizing is you're embarrassed by the miracles. So you try and, explain away the miracles. And, the classic one was the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And I remember sitting in school assemblies and hearing portentous headmasters say this, that really, of course, what happened was that everybody had in fact brought enough for themselves, but they were selfishly keeping it under their capacious Middle Eastern robes. And when the little boy shared, they were all shamed into sharing as well. So the thing is reduced, the glorious miracle of the multiplication, the constant feeding that he does all the time. Every time a grain of seed is dropped into the ground and grows up into many heads, there is a miracle of the multiplication of the loaves. The fishes are multiplying. It's not even as if we can't see already without recourse to miracle. That's why St. Augustine says those two miracles of both the multiplication of loaves and of the water into wine are only Jesus doing very quickly, so we'll notice it, what the Lord in his wisdom is doing over a couple of seasons in nature. Anyway, you may have been afflicted with that kind of demythologizing, explaining away. And in critiquing it, Lewis says, there's no point in straining a few gnats, because if you're going to take any interest in the gospel, you're going to swallow the camel. There is a big miracle. The whole thing, all the little miracles are signposts. That's why John calls the water into wine a sign. Same way, it's the first of the signs that he did. They all point to this one enormous, grand miracle, this astonishing miracle, which is that God should get involved at all. And specifically, the paradox that the creator enters the creation. This is, if you like, Shakespeare writing himself into Hamlet, so that Hamlet can have the opportunity of meeting Shakespeare. And Lewis uses a really interesting literary example, which is a piece of apologetics I think is unsurpassed. This is the parallel he makes. He says, look, supposing there was a great novel, which everybody agreed was a great novel, but there was a missing chapter, and everybody knew that the central chapter in this novel was missing. You can imagine, therefore, that many, some literary critics would try from what preceded and what followed to reconstruct what might have been in that chapter. Some people might forge something and claim to have found the missing chapter. And he said the test would always be whether the book not only continued to make sense, but made gloriously new sense, whether the content of the missing chapter suddenly made sense of puzzling things in the first part or inexplicable things in the second part, and produced a thematic unity, a literary unity, an imaginative and symbolic unity. Then you would say if it did all of those things, it would make sense of the entire work. And then he makes us move. He says, when we consider the entire beautiful, intriguing, sometimes incomprehensible, often puzzling work, which is the cosmos, and within it, human life and death, he says, I think, for those who've chosen to exclude it, that the gospel, and specifically the Christ event, is the missing chapter. And then he goes on to show how this pattern of incarnation, death, and resurrection suddenly gives profundity and meaning to all kinds of things which we observe. We notice that there is a pattern of death and resurrection in everything, that night is followed by morning, that winter is followed by spring, and the winter-spring thing becomes incredibly important to Lewis at this point, and that, the burial of the seed leads to the rising of the grain, and that the pattern of death and resurrection is the motif of being as we know it now. So if somebody comes into the middle of the story claiming to be the creator of this story, and then specifically takes the example of the grain of wheat falling into the ground and rising up to speak of his own death and resurrection, it's reasonable to suppose that the poet has wandered into the poem and given you some idea of what the poem is actually about and helped you to understand it. People do, even in my, to compare the sublime with the ridiculous, people tell me that my poems make more sense when they hear me read them. So this great cosmic poem, this eternal language, as Coleridge calls it, which thy God doth utter, who doth teach himself in all and all things in himself, is interpreted for us when the poet comes in. So that's the pitch that Lewis makes for the grand miracle. And then he says that he looks at the pattern of the grand miracle from incarnation through to death, descent into hell, resurrection, and ascent into heaven. Now, we're concerned, obviously, particularly with death, resurrection, and ascent, because that these are to do with the last things that we're considering. But we'll say, so I want to take you to, I think, one of the most glorious passages in the grand miracle, in which he speaks not only of what Christ is doing for us, but for what Christ is doing for the whole cosmos. So let's just hear it. I'm talking of this whole huge pattern of descent, down, down, and then up again. What we ordinarily call the resurrection being just, so to speak, the point at which it turns. Think what that descent is. And here is a wonderful riff on the kenosis passage in, though he was found in form equal to God, he did not cling to equality God, but emptied himself. Think of what that descent is, the coming down, not only into humanity, but into those 9 months which precede human birth, in which they tell us we all recapitulate strange pre-human, subhuman forms of life, and going lower still, into being a corpse, a thing which, if this ascending movement had not begun, would presently have passed out of the organic altogether and have gone back into the inorganic, as all corpses do. It's an amazing piece of writing. Write down, take a minute. One has a picture of someone going right down and dredging the sea bottom. One has a picture of a strong man trying to lift a very big, complicated burden. He stoops down and gets himself right under it so that he himself disappears. And then he straightens his back and moves off with the whole thing swaying on his shoulders. Or else, this is a wonderful image, one has the picture of a diver stripping off garment after garment, making himself naked, then flashing for a moment in the air, and then down through the green and warm and sunlit water to the pitch black, cold, freezing water, down into the mud and slime, then up again, his lungs almost bursting, back again to the green and warm and sunlit water, and then at last out into the sunshine, holding in his hand the dripping thing he went down to get. And this thing is human nature, but associated with it, all nature, the new universe. So God is coming down right into the heart of the very cosmos he's made, and then he's bringing it up into a new creation. And this movement of descent and ascent is really essential to Christianity. And as you'll see, even in the vision of heaven, there is still this, as the Greeks like to say, katabasis, descent as well as ascent. So now you'll see from the ... that I've gone further on. I want to turn now to he's used these images of the diver, the person lifting up something. Very important that it's not just human nature that he's rescuing. This is not an individualized, I'm going to be a brand snatched from the burning and slipped away to this place. No, on the contrary. Lewis is completely with Milton, and Milton is with St. Paul, when St. Paul says, the creation has been subjected to futility, but in hope. And it's waiting for the revelation of the children of God, of the sons, because what becomes of us becomes of nature too. Because what we did affected nature. So Milton, you may remember, Paradise Lost, it's only a couple of chapters in Genesis, right? He makes 12 books out of it. And you've got your way to book 9. And it hasn't even happened yet, the fall, So finally in book 9, so saying in evil hour with rash hand she reached, and she takes the fruit. And what is the first thing that Milton says at that moment. He doesn't say, and so we begin to discuss the complete depravity of human nature. Think about that. He says, earth felt the wound. It's the first thing that happens when man falls. Earth felt the wound, and nature, sighing out through all her works, gave sign that all was lost. So with our fall is the fall of the world for which we were made responsible. We're now the silent planet. And therefore the whole of nature waits for this resurrection. It concerns the whole of nature because there is going to be a new creation. Behold, I make all things new. So the next image after the diver that he uses in this poem, I call it a poem, it is a kind of praise poetry, but in this great sermon, is the image of spring. Now, bear in mind in the next passage that I read that this sermon was preached in 1945, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came out, I believe, in 1950. So I always have to check with Jerry, and he'll have that. So let's look at what he says. He's talking about the way in which the coming of the Christ event, introduces the new creation into the old. And the new creation, being a new order of being, has different laws, as it were, different modus operandi, different set of possibilities than the old creation, which has been subjected to futility. So the miracles that have happened, this is so good because he's, so the opposite of Bultmann, that he's really saying, no, bring on the miracles. The miracles are precisely the evidence of the new creation. So the miracles that have already happened are, of course, as Scripture often says, the first fruits of that cosmic summer which is presently coming on. He uses the phrase twice. I particularly liked Cosmic Summer. When I first read this, the old Deadhead, Grateful Dead fan in me woke up because Cosmic Summer was completely what it was all about. But he is using the word cosmic, of course, in a more profound way than even Jerry Garcia. So, the first fruits of that cosmic summer, which is presently coming on. Christ has risen, and so shall we rise. There it is. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the primer and pattern for anything we are to say about our new life in the new creation. Christ has risen, so we shall rise. St. Peter, for a few seconds, walked on the water. And the day will come when there will be a remade universe infinitely obedient to the will of glorified and obedient man. When we can do all things, when we shall be those gods that we are described as being in Scripture. To be sure, it feels wintry enough still, but often in the very early spring, it feels like that. 2,000 years are only a day or two by this scale. A man really ought to say, the resurrection happened 2,000 years ago, in the same spirit in which he says, I saw a crocus yesterday. Because we know what is coming behind the crocus. The spring comes slowly down this way, but the great thing is that the corner has been turned. There is, of course, then really interesting, there is, of course, this difference, that in the natural spring, the crocus cannot choose whether it will respond or not. We can. We have the power either of withstanding the spring and sinking back into the cosmic winter, or of going on into those high midsummer pomps in which our leader, the Son of Man, already dwells, and to which he is calling us. It remains for us to follow or not, to die in this winter, or to go on into that spring and that summer. Extraordinary, a kind of beautiful distinction at the end, this essence of our freedom. But I cannot read that without thinking, of the poor, unfortunate dwarf being abused by the witch. She says, this is no Thor, this is spring. When the spring comes, the coming of spring is the great sign of the resurrection in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I mean, here it is already laid out in this winter-spring move. in a sermon preached 5 years earlier. Just before we go on to what the way Lewis develops that final point about the crocus can't choose, but we can I just say a word about the 2,000 years ago, or only a day or two by this scale? And just some years ago, when I was one of the clergy at St Edward King and Martyr in the centre of Cambridge, we invited Sir John Polkinghorne, the distinguished cosmologist, but also Anglican priest, to preach for us on Easter Sunday, our Easter Sunday sermon. And we were all very excited. The great man was there. He's a fine speaker, and was president of Queen's College and a fellow of the Royal Society, and so on. So he got up into the pulpit, and we were all thinking, well, I hope, let's hang on here for the ride. And he began to talk about what people think of as the Big Bang in terms of what a physicist means by a singularity. So, because it's a singularity in the sense that there's nothing else you can compare it with, because there is nothing else. You couldn't say it was big or little or large, because all these are comparatives. It's a thing which is singular unto itself. But he says from the moment that it happens, as it were, then not only does matter and energy, and probably energy first and then energy cooling into matter, begin to emerge, but also the fabric of space-time itself. And with that, the laws of nature. The laws of nature are themselves newly made within this unfolding. And he went on like this for about 10 minutes. And I was thinking, well, this is a really impressive lecture on cosmology, but it is Easter morning. I just wondered if maybe we might, there might be some small mention of Jesus or the resurrection. So he builds it up like this, and it's almost, and then he kind of looks me straight in the eye, and he says, we are however many billion years it was from that singularity. He said, luckily we can look back a little bit. We can begin to reconstruct, because of how long light takes to travel, a little bit, but we can't get close to the event. And then he says, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, of course, is the singularity of the new creation. It is literally the moment it is the Big Bang of the entire new creation. And he says, we are amazingly close to this event. What is 2,000 years? Already we're beginning to see the fabric of space-time of the old thing changing. Look at what's going on in prayer. Prayer is clearly effective. It's clearly communal. It's clearly impossible according to the old laws of physics. But boy, is it happening. And he goes through to see us talk about a series of things from church life, from the sacramental life to, not only the miracles in the Bible, but the miracles of every Christian community. And I was thinking, wow, and it reminded me of this. And I asked him at the end of this great sermon, it was so exciting, because, you just felt this is, the resurrection, the waves are getting bigger and bigger, the new cosmos is unfolding further. It's hugely exciting. And I said, have you read the Grand Miracle? And he goes, the Grand what? And so I was really, it was a kind of corroboration to me that two of the greatest minds from Cambridge University. I realized there was an earlier Oxford episode with Lewis, but we'll overlook that. Two of the great minds from Cambridge University had come to the same conclusion about the resurrection from completely different disciplines, great masters on the one hand in science and on the other in the arts, both coming to this same conclusion about the nature of the resurrection. So anyway, to return to my text, I must watch myself. So Lewis makes this really important distinction between ourselves and crocuses, which is that they can't choose, but we can. And I think the two other works that I want to talk about now, The Great Divorce and The Last Battle, I think they depend already on the theology that's there in the Grand Miracle, but I think they pay especial attention to this question of choice, to the enormity and eternal significance of not just one choice, but a series of choices that we make. So of course, that what you see dramatized in The Great Divorce. The Great Divorce is a kind of, it's like, I suppose it's Dante meets George MacDonald in A Dream by C.S. Lewis, and it's very modeled on Dante and a series of encounters with people in their afterlife, through which you see pictorially and symbolically it's reflected back into you what your choices might be and how you might be making them. You know, I mean, a lot of Dante scholars have said quite rightly that it's not, Dante pretends to be telling you a story about the afterlife and a journey through three realms. What he's actually giving you is an accurate map of your own soul. If you look deep enough, you can find all the circles of hell in there, including the frozen ego at the bottom. But you can also find all the redemptive, purgative, purifying possibilities of the Purgatorio, and you can find all the circles of heaven too, and you have to choose how you move between them. So that's what's going on. There's a series of choices. In some ways, I think it's quite a pessimist. Everybody, you know, has a go at Lewis for the Great Divorce and at MacDonald for so-called universalism, where, you know, on the basis that they think they're being too generous about the generous love of God. I don't think you can be too generous about the generous love of God. But in fact, my difficulty with the Great Divorce is that of the 9 or 10 people that he meets, only one of them gets to heaven on that occasion. I'm very glad it's the young man with the lust problem. Obviously, that's immensely comforting, you know, and that's also very, very Dantesque. Because when they have to deal with the final issue of lust in the last of the circles of the Purgatorio, for some reason there's loads of poets. I don't know what it is about poets, but anyway, they dance through the fire and they get there. So I'm very glad about the guy that got through. But I mean, I'd like to, you know, Beckett, when he says, when a character in Waiting for Godot says, one of the thieves was saved, it's a reasonable percentage. 50. Great line. You know, Lewis doesn't even get to as good a percent as Beckett offers in that. So I would want to be a bit more encouraging than him, but you do see the choice dramatized. And of course, in the passage I'm going to show you, MacDonald says, will you make sure that everybody knows this is a dream? Let's just look at this lovely little passage. Just a little before we get to it, one of the things you need to know is that in the hell part of the story, which turns out to be no more than a little crack, you know, in the dirt, compared with the reality of heaven, there seems to be an almost perpetual twilight. Now, twilight is what precedes night. Twilight is what you experience just before the sun goes down and you're in the dark. In the heaven, or as it were, the lowlands of the true highlands of heaven that he meets MacDonald in, it's dawn, but the sun's not quite up. And you realize that this kind of suffused light of dawn with the sun about to rise, or twilight with the sun about to set, are his way of saying, which again is in Dante, that there will come a time when it is decisively day in one place and decisively night in the other. In between times, there's a choice. In between times, you can have the day trip. And it's this question of how long the in-between times and this time of choice last that the end of the book is concerned with. A dream. This is him speaking to MacDonald, of course. A dream, then am I not really here, sir? No, son, said he said, kindly taking my hand in his. It's not so good as that. The bitter drink of death is still before you. You're only dreaming. Which, of course, Lewis goes back to this when they're worried about that in the end of the last battle. And he says, no, it's all right. The dream is over. You're awake. But for Lewis at this point, the dream is not over. You're only dreaming, and if you come to tell what you've seen, make it plain that it was but a dream. Ye see, ye make it very plain. I'll give no poor fool the pretext for thinking you're claiming knowledge no mortal knows. I'll have no Swedenborgs or Veloins among my children. Oh, God forbid, sir, I said, trying to look very wise. He has forbidden it, that's what I'm telling ye. As he said this, he looked more Scotch than ever. I was gazing steadfastly on his face. The vision of the chessmen had faded. The vision of the chessmen, you may remember, is an allegorical vision in which he sees ourselves as we perceive ourselves now as being like mere figures on a chessboard. but our true and immortal souls as like great gods and goddesses making the moves with our little bodies. You may remember that. The vision of the chessmen had faded, and once more the quiet woods and the cool light before sunrise were about us. Then, still looking at his face, I saw that there something that sent a quiver through my whole body. I stood at that moment with my back to the east. If you were in church the other evening, this orientation thing, will we turn to face Christ, or will we be like John Donne, riding westwards when our soul's form bends towards the east? I stood at that moment with my back to the east and the mountains, and he facing me looked towards them. His face flushed with a new light. A fern 30 yards behind him turned golden. The eastern side of every tree trunk grew bright. Shadows deepened. All the time there had been bird noises, trillings, chatter poured out from every branch. Cocks were crowing. There was music of hounds and horns. Above all, and angels, and the wood itself sang. It comes, they sang. Sleepers awake. Over my shoulder I essayed, not long enough to see, or did I see, the rim that shoots time dead with golden arrows and puts to flight all phantasmal shapes. Face in the folds of my teacher's robe. Total Dante and Virgil move there. Caught by the morning, and I am a ghost. But it was too late. Intolerable of edge and weight came thundering upon my head. Next moment, the folds of the old ink-stained cloth on my study table, which I had pulled down with me, blocks of light were only the books which I had pulled off with it, falling out of the old room, hunched on the floor beside a black and empty grate. The clock howling overhead. What a way to end a book about heaven. But he's fearful of that time when it will be day or night. And the whole book to encourage us and to encourage him to be aware of this coming dawn, this fully and gladly to choose the dawn and the spring over the night and the winter. And the thing that might be both knocking him down but potentially waking him up are books. Become books. And there is a sense in which a book contains light. Somebody happily quoted Milton's book, "You're like shooting reason in the eye," you know, that there's light in books. Beneath the weight. I believe it was Didymus the grammarian who was actually killed by pulling one of his own books off the shelf and falling crushed beneath it. But what are we to make of the books, including the for this conference? Where do they tend? So, there's a book that now I know my time is slipping away, so let me now turn to the last passages where I think these issues are dealt with, which is the last battle. And we pick up, we have a similar moment as we had with the Great Divorce, that is to say, light. But this time, we are having to share the experience with sinful old C.S. Lewis, and Lewis would be the first person to say, fearful of that day, where with Lucy, whose name, of course, contains the word light, the Catholic understanding, who blesses sight and vision, who is the seer and the spiritual person among the children. So the light. Lucy saw that a great series of many-colored cliffs led staircase. I'd love to see that if the original manuscript out staircase, but I think, Anton, you can reasonably make a color. The cliffs led up in front of them like a giant staircase. Aslan himself was coming, leaping down from cliff to cliff like a living and beauty. That's wonderful because we're going to have cataracts and waterfalls and they're going to swim up. Everything which God creates shows some aspect of his power and beauty, and but what I want to point and draw to your attention is the way in what level of ascent they're going to go high up into the mountain country, and the great mantra is going to be mountains, the true mountains of Aslan's country, and we see them. But right into the middle of that ascent, he brings a motif of descent. Aslan himself coming, leaping down. So he has led up in front of them in one sentence and leaping down in the other. And I think that goes right back to the grand miracle. This pattern of descent, then up again. What we ordinarily call the resurrection is only the turning point. I think he sees the descent, the kenosis, the self-emptying. Though he was found in form equal to God, he did not cling to equality with God, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and was obedient even to. Wherefore, God hath highly exalted him and given him a name that's these two things. I think he sees that as essential to God. So even though they are ascending and they're already, as it were, in Aslan's country, there is still a coming down to them. There's still that delight of a God who wants to come down to where we are, who wants to accommodate himself to us, who chooses, as it were, that, if you like, incarnational descent, that in some sense, that is still there. And that might connect interestingly. I mean, there were the great experts here on kind of Reform orthodoxy and the kind of new thinkings in the 17th century about the beatific vision being not some abstract philosophical vision of the grand of all being in a kind of a Thomas Aquinas way, but is actually seeing the face of Jesus. That the Father still contents to pour himself into the Son. The Son is still eternally, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's certainly the view that Lewis is taking here, because they see the God in the form that they have known him best thus far, but not alone and always in that form, as we shall see. So Aslan comes. And then you get, this is a sublime moment. It's going to be followed by an even more sublime moment as we get to the end of the novel. And yet, in the midst of that, you almost get comic relief. Lewis interjects a playful little thing about Aslan and Puzzle the donkey. And Puzzle, I mean, poor old Puzzle must be puzzled indeed. You could say, although he was invaded into it by his false friend, the ape, poor old Puzzle has impersonated Aslan, which is about as well. Here is this compassionate descent of the lion to the donkey. Of course, intended to where ox and ass fed in straw, and of course, whom Aslan called to him was Puzzle the donkey. You never saw a donkey look feebler. Walked up to Aslan, and he looked beside Aslan as a small kitten looks beside a St. Bernard. Man bowed down his head. Do you see the descent? And he bowed down his head and whispered something to Puzzle, at which his long ears went down. And then he said something else at which the ears perked up again. The humans couldn't hear what he said either time. Now, he set his playful, childlike readers, whom he respects and who knows who will work this out, he set them in the story of puzzle, literally a little puzzle, hasn't he? They're to imagine, what did he say that made the ears droop down? And what did he say that made the ears stand up again? And I think Lewis may have been thinking of that little poem, which we know he said he liked, of Chesterton's Donkey's Glory, where the donkey says, "Oh, I'm the devil's walking parody of all forfeited things." But the donkey says, "Fools, for I also had my hour, one far fierce hour and sweet. There was a shout about my ears and palms before my feet." And I think Aslan is telling something about the donkey's glory to the donkey, which subtly prepares us for what Aslan is going to reveal about himself at this point to the children, but over which C.S. Lewis very properly draws a veil, because he wants the children to know, and the children always know, as we heard in that letter earlier on, the children always know who Aslan is. So, then Aslan turned to them and said, "You do not yet look so happy as I mean you to be." And this is where the children get what Lewis doesn't get in The Great Divorce, where he has to hear George MacDonald say, "Am I not really here, sir?" "No, son," he said, kindly taking my hand in his. "It's not so good as that. The bitter drink of death is still before you." But here, "You do not yet look so happy as I mean you to be," says Aslan. Lucy said, "We're so afraid of being sent away, Aslan. You have sent us back into our world so often." "No fear of that," said Aslan. "Have you not guessed?" Their hearts leapt and a wild hope rose within them. "There was a real railway accident," said Aslan softly. "Your father and mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning." Wonderful. The very thing that in The Great Divorce Lewis is actually afraid of. But fortunately, the dream of life has not ended for him there, and he's able to go on making the choices that lead heavenward. This is the morning, and this is just wonderful. "And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion. But the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after." Little nod to Tolkien's Eucatastrophe. But for them, we can truly say this is the end. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. I think that's one of the finest endings to any book. It ends with a beginning, and I will also end probably over time there. Thank you.